country's in absolute crisis. Crisis at home and in its positioning abroad, and something needs to change quite dramatically.
Was there something in her leadership that made you lose confidence in the Tory party's ability to fight and do anything good in the next election?
No, Kane Baden, I like her actually as a person. I think she's very principled. However,
do you feel a degree of grief about moving from one party to another?
And I wasn't a passive member, I was an active member.
What's your measure of Reform's commitment and ability to actually tackle the creep of Islamism in Britain and resolve that real threat to our way of life?
Oh, I think the resolve is absolute.
How do you feel with your staunchly pro-Ukraine credentials going into a party that isn't pro-Putin but has some problematic news reports in its back catalogue in that regard?
Nigel Farage believes in putting British strategic interests first. He knows that Vladimir Putin is a bad man. He knows that. I tell you this, there are traitors, frankly, and these are treacherous people who are taking money, foreign states, to undermine their own country.
Hello, and thank you for joining us on The Brink. I'm Jake Wallace-Simons.
And I'm Andrew Fox. And today we're going to be interviewing Dr. Alan Mendoza, who until this week was a councillor for Westminster Council for the Conservatives, but has now defected to the Reform Party, for whom he is now the chief advisor on global affairs. And for full disclosure, Alan is the chief executive of the Henry Jackson Society, for whom I'm an associate fellow. But that's not going to stop me from asking Alan the difficult questions.
Now, don't forget to like and subscribe, as they say. And if you're listening on audio, please do give us a lot of stars, ideally 5. And now, without further ado, we present Alan Mendoza on The Brink. Alan Mendoza, Executive Director of Henry Jackson Society and Reform UK's Chief Advisor on Global Affairs as of a few days ago. Thank you for joining us on The Brink.
Delighted to be here, Jake and Andrew.
Well, I'm going to take the first question, Alan, if I may. And what I thought we could do to start with is have you take us through your kind of political journey. And if you could paint us a picture of your political beliefs and values and kind of your history with the Tory party, and then we'll look into reform afterwards, if that works.
Absolutely. So I was a terribly tragic child who was interested in politics from a very young age. My childhood political heroine was, of course, Margaret Thatcher. And I vividly remember, and this is, my street cred is going down by the moment by saying this, vividly remember that when I was 9 years old, 1987 general election, I was telling my fellow pupils in my primary school, as we were queuing for lunch, that Margaret Thatcher was the only choice for Britain. That sort of tells you that something in what her philosophy chimed with a 9-year-old boy, God knows how or why.
Right.
But it just seemed to me that having brought up in a fairly political household, people who were interested in politics, who spoke about it all the time and chatted it, and looking at the ideas from even at that early stage, I just was attracted to that vision of a state that exists, but a smaller state, one where you saw that people could rise up, within a generation and make the most of it. I saw my own, sort of family had done the same thing. My father had not grown up in a particularly prosperous environment. He grew up in New Cross in southeast London, so that's not, sort of particularly at the time a salubrious neighbourhood. But he'd managed to take advantage of what the country had offered. Made a bit of money, not much, but a bit, and you could see that there was progress. And it seemed to me that idea of offering people the chance to achieve their personal growth for their family, growth for society, and growth for the country were the sort of the right ambitions. And as I got older and looked into it more and more, despite a rather interesting teenage wobble into socialism, I quickly reasserted the sort of sense of those core values of understanding that it's individual freedom at the end of the day that is the core of what makes our society here in the UK and more broadly in the West. And, sort of just started following that path. And I actually joined the Conservative Party in 1995. We had a great local MP, Sir Rhodes Boyson. Do you remember Sir Rhodes Boyson with those amazing sideburns? Rhodes was a philosopher. He was a thinker. He was, a sort of, although he'd grown to fame as a headmaster, he was a serious political thinker in terms of right-wing philosophy. And that chimed with me very much as well. So I was happy to join with him knocking on doors. One thing led to another. I went to Cambridge, became chairman of the Conservative Association there. And don't forget, this is at the most awful time for the Conservative Party. This was 95, 96, 97. Knocking on doors on the 97 election was not a pleasant sort of exercise to do, I took it forward because I thought the ideas were still there. And if I'm, fast forwarding, I joined as a councillor in 2 different places. I've been actively involved for a long, long time. I even, I stood for Parliament at one point in 2015. But looking back on it over time, I suspect that time with Margaret Thatcher being in charge of the party was perhaps the period still that I look back to as the apogee of what it was to be a Conservative in Britain at that, in my lifetime. And that told me, fairly recently that something needed to change. And I'm not interested in, I want to be clear, in wailing on the Conservatives. They were my home for 30 years. There's some brilliant people in the Conservative Party. But I don't think I'm there today, which is why I have left the Conservatives and gone to Reform.
So if we can, before we go to the Tories and all that stuff, just to really pin down your core beliefs. So from what you said, small state, you're, I presume, a low tax kind of guy.
Absolutely, yeah.
And you've made your name really at the Henry Jackson Society as being a very attuned to the Islamist threat in Britain and overseas. And also you're very pro-Ukraine. That's right, isn't it?
Absolutely. Freedom, democracy, human rights as a general kind of concept. Look, these are the underpinnings of the West. If we look at what the UK historically was, what we still are, and what the broader idea of the West is, these are the animating ideals that made the West and transformed the world, frankly.
Is there anything else that I've missed out in that list that you want to add to that? So there are lots
of things kind of thrown in there as well. I mean, if you look at as a philosophy, look, there does need to be a state. I'm not one of these people who thinks there shouldn't be a state. And it's there as a safety net for people to help them. But the point is, it shouldn't become a dependency culture. That is not what we should be doing. If you want to bring the best out of people, you want to the old phrase, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, you feed him for life, etc. In this case as well. This is about what we should be doing as a country. It is about actually lifting people's horizons, saying anything's possible. There are structural difficulties. We understand that. The goal, as always, is not equality of outcome. It's equality of opportunity. And that is something I think everyone in this country should aspire to.
I mean, that's a solid, we can call it a Mendoza festo. I like it.
Bring it on
a personal level, do you feel a degree of grief about moving from one party to another? I mean, you've been a Conservative for an awfully long time, and now you've jumped to Reform. Is there a sort of nagging kind of almost like a grief as you leave and move to the next?
It's sorrow. I think, this is not some people leave in blazes of anger and, something terrible has happened. I don't think something terrible has happened. I think it's just a sad parting of the ways, basically, because I don't think that I'm still there. So yeah, it's that sort of sense of, 30 years is a long time to be someone. I wasn't a passive member, I was an active member. I've literally knocked on doors, across the country.
Something terrible has happened to the Tory party, hasn't it? It happened slowly over 14 years and then suddenly at the last election. And I mean, looking at Kemi Badenoch's leadership, was there something in her leadership that made you lose confidence in the Tory party's ability to fight and do anything good in the next election?
No, this isn't about personalities, and I think it's quite important. This is Kemi Badenoch. I like her actually as a person. I think she's very principled. However, I think the broader picture within the Conservative Party has been one of decline for some time, and a sense of not really knowing what it stood for as a party as well. I think we saw that in the last Parliament, where there was a lot of confusion about which kind of Conservative Party are you? Are you this sort of Conservative Party, that sort of Conservative? I think the Conservatives have quite got to that. But again, it's not about personality. I think it's a struggle. I've got tremendous respect for what Kemi Badenoch's trying to do, just as a political figure right now, at a very difficult time to be a political party leader.
But she's trying to reinstate those values, isn't she? And defections make that task quite a lot more difficult for her.
Well, I don't regard it in a sense as a defection, to go, oh, well, I'm the same person as before. My ideas are still my ideas. I just don't think the Conservative Party is the home for them right now, because I'm not sure that even with that effort that is going on, that they're going to be able to, accommodate the wide range of views in the Conservative Party. And let's not forget that although the leader is trying to put one thing down, there are many other conservatives who believe very different things. And I suspect that may be a challenge for them to be able to present a coherent whole ultimately. But, ultimately, I've taken a look over the last, year in particular at what is happening in Reform UK. And I'm struck by the vision, the boldness, the appetite for radical change. And I look at it from the following perspective. The country is an absolute crisis, in my view. It's a crisis at home and in its positioning abroad. And something needs to change quite dramatically. Now, you're not going to tinker at the edges and do that. And I think, the electorate made their verdict on the Conservative Party last time round and aren't ready to forgive them. But I think forget about, the idea of that's a bad party. That's not what this is about. This is about there is a force now, a dynamic force in British politics that understands, I think, where the British people are and where they want to be, quite crucially. And it's more about, in a sense, the pull factor than the push factor. And that's quite important as well. I think looking at where Reform are and what their openness to radical solutions for the country, that is what is very attractive. And it's not just me. I mean, I was struck by attending Reform conference, just in my, sort of normal think tank hat on. Firstly, the positivity. Secondly, the energy and vigor. And lastly, this is really interesting, the number of people I met who had never done anything political at all, felt they wanted to do something for the country and felt that was the place to do it. That struck me, Jake, as being something very, very powerful and very different to the norm that we've seen in this country.
But nonetheless,
so are we talking here about a sort of sense of dynamism versus a party that is still split between what, going back to Thatcher, what she would have called the wets, and those with sound ideas? Is that what we're talking about here? It's one's dynamic and united, one is divided and in a state of decay.
I think it's more about the animating spirit. That's the whole point. The animating spirit of Reform seems to me, at least, to be a belief that that people can be who they are and don't have to conform to political correctness or to what some liberal intelligentsia demands they should be. Secondly, that there is a pride in the country and a sense of who we are as a nation and what we have done over history. But most importantly, going forward, forget those two things. The building, on those is that, our tomorrows can be better than our todays still. And that there is a British grit and resilience that can be kind of brought out. Yes, times are tough. No one's denying that. But it can be brought out and inspire people to think that actually things will work out, and that it gives, if you like, the animal spirits, the British people, free rein to go out and restore the vigor that we once were known for.
I mean, you leaving the Tory party in this way is going to be just more bad news for the Tories. I mean, the splash on the Telegraph yesterday was that the Tories are looking at only 14 MPs, according to current polling, in the next election. But nonetheless, it does seem as if without the right uniting in the next election, there's a possibility that the country will be handed once again to the Prime Minister, whose name I can't bear to articulate right now. We are looking at the polling. We're looking at if we unite Reform and the Tories, according to YouGov, we're looking at 44%. According to Ipsos, we're looking at 49%. That's between a majority and a hung parliament. So it's very much not in we're safe territory, and that's it with the two parties united. Looking ahead, as someone who's left the Tories to Reform, how would you feel about entering an election with the Tories on side?
Well, look, these are hypothetical questions. Firstly, Jake, let's be realistic. There's not going to be an election, for some time. I know Nigel Farage has, thinks that 2027 is, a possibility. It might well be because of the economic, sort of conditions that might lend itself. But really, the only way that's going to happen is if basically the markets or the international, economy decides that Britain is fundamentally over, and therefore there has to be an election to restore that kind of credibility. If that doesn't happen, we're in for the long haul. Let's be, honest about it, and we're going to be in 28, 29. So I think a lot depends on the financial, immediacy as to what happens. And then I think, therefore, there's also a lot of questions about how you look at that next election and, the electoral landscape. Once again, if it comes at the back of 5 years of a Labour government that is, that's proceeded along the lines of what it has done to date, I don't think, uniting the right is necessary. I don't think that's the point. I think you'll see something very different. If it's if it's a very different political environment, I don't know, things happen. Black swans occur. Who would have thought COVID could have come and disrupted things so dramatically? But
I guess what I'm trying to drill down to is whether you would like to see the Tories to decline as much as possible and Reform to ascend as much as possible as we go into the next election, or whether some part of you still wants the Tories to survive, perform well, perhaps in a future coalition with Reform.
I'm going to answer that question in a different way, because I'm now a Reform Party member, and of course I'm going to be backing Reform to form the government. And that, I'm not, again, what happens to other parties is not, our business, basically. Our business is to try and present an agenda for government that the majority of the British people, or, a plurality of the British people, think is appropriate for the country. And that is the only job Reform should be focusing on right now, not either destroying another political party or trying to help another political party. That's for them. That's for them to do. I think it's really about what can Reform show that it can present to the UK, to British people, to say, actually, you're going to be the government.
So you don't care?
No, I on a serious note, the Conservative Party will do what the Conservative Party does. And that's up to it. Labour will do what it does. The Greens will do what they do. The Lib Dems will do what they do. My sole interest in advising Reform is to advise Reform, not to advise other parties on what they should and shouldn't do along the line.
Are you going to stand for Reform in the next election?
Totally unclear at this point in time. I didn't come with any grand vision of going, oh, yes, that's what I'm going to do in that way. I stood once for Parliament, but it was already 10, 11 years ago. So I feel I'm growing a bit long in the tooth. But, as an advisor, yeah, sure, I'm happy to give the benefit of my experience on that basis. Could I be persuaded? Sure. I mean, I've always been in active politics. I have run for electoral office as a councillor. You do that. But I haven't made any definitive decisions yet. I think, on a serious note, what is most important right now is trying to create a coherent agenda, as I said, to convince the British people that this is the right home for their vote going forwards.
I mean, on that note, Reform is facing an uphill challenge in terms of preparing to be a credible party of government. In addition to yourself, it needs, according to Alistair Heath's analysis in the Telegraph the other day, between 30 to 40 high quality cabinet or senior advisor level personalities over the next year, 400 excellent parliamentary candidates for winnable seats, 350 great nominees to the House of Lords. I'll put forward Andrew. Let's see if that happens.
Put for yourself, Jake. I'm not sure.
Well, I didn't want to say a couple of hundred high-quality ministerial advisors and hundreds of appointees to transform the civil service. This is a huge task, isn't it? A huge task. Will Reform manage to do it, to be the credible party of the next government going into the next election, do you think?
So it is a big task, there's no doubt about it. And people have got to remember that Reform is a very new party. Yes, of course, Nigel Farage is an amazingly experienced politician. 25 years in, on the front line of politics. And that's, that is significant that he's not a newbie. He knows his way around the system.
But he's one person, isn't he?
Yeah, exactly, one person. And look, Zia Yusuf, Richard Tice, you've got
three.
Okay, three, Lee Anderson, you've got people coming through in terms of that setup. Yes. But here's the thing, a new party, 2-3 years old, which has grown at the rate it's grown. Already you've got to give it some credit to say, look where it's come from, where it started. Now it's at the moment it's been in the polls above 30% for a year now. That is already quite an amazing achievement for a fairly new party that doesn't necessarily have the infrastructure you've said. But here's the thing: the party understands where it needs to go and get to. It is moving fast and breaking things at a very, very quick rate to look at how can we develop that. I think Danny Kruger's move to Reform was particularly interesting in this regard, because Danny has had obviously a long history in sort of the kind of policy work that needs to be done. What Zia Yusuf is doing as policy head is fascinating as well, because he's coming at it from not necessarily a party political angle, but coming at it from a experienced business and finance environment as well, coming into it. Do we need more people? Absolutely. And I think though more people are going to come. I don't mean necessarily people from the Conservative Party or other parties. I think there are lots of people outside politics. That's the point I was trying to make a little earlier, who have been inspired for the first time to go, actually, we've got something to contribute. We run businesses, or we understand this in the healthcare system, and we've got things to do. So I suspect that what will happen is You may not have 40 people who ran the National Health Service or something like that, but you're going to get a spread of people who have had very valuable life experience, including of running things, which is quite significant, and who will be able to come together in the next, as I said, let's assume the election's in 27, we've still got 2 years, okay, but if it's in 29, you've got 4 years. There's a heck of a lot of time to kind of get that right. The key thing is that Reform understands the challenge, wants to deal with the challenge, and there's a bit of a playbook also looking at what Donald Trump did in term 2 rather than term 1. You could make the argument that if you were looking at this from that perspective, that if Reform hadn't been thinking about it, it could be Donald Trump 1, which got mired into lots of mess. Well, Donald Trump 2 came in with obviously a sense of, here's a plan, these are the people, we're going to press ahead, we're going to do it, and as a result, you get things done. The lesson is you've got to come in with an agenda, and then you've got to be very quick at enacting it. I think this current government's gone wrong because it didn't have that agenda quite extraordinarily when it came in. I'm not sure it knew what it believed in. So Reform can cultivate that belief, and then bring the people in who can then shape the policies and do the delivery on that. I think it can be a success.
I mean, Reform have an example of doing this wrong already, don't they? I mean, they've got Kent Council. They won 57 of 81 seats, took control. They've already lost 9. We've seen videos of, I think it's the chief, the Reform leader down there, sort of swearing and that's been leaked and yelling at the councillors. It doesn't seem that the Reform's first stab at local council rule is going particularly smoothly. So is there a lesson to take from that, or is that indicative of issues with the wider party?
Well, hang on. I mean, firstly, let's just point out Kent County Council is one of only, is one out of many that Reform now control. You're not seeing these problems in other places. In fact, you're seeing tremendous successes in other local authorities. If you look at the, the sort of pronouncements of the waste that's been cut across the board in Reform councils, there's been a, significant process. Yes, the Kent issue is one, but there are others along that path. I've just arrived in the party. I've got, frankly, no idea what's been going on in Kent from the perspective of local situations. Is the National Party looking at it? Yeah, of course they are. Are they going to be able to turn it around? I think they probably are going to be able to turn it around. But on that local level, I think it's been a case of learning on the job. But that's not what's going to happen on the national level, because this is very carefully coordinated. And the sense is that there's going to be a good team around from day one who are going to move forwards. But, I know people like to speak about Kent, but look at the other councils that are out, you're not seeing that chaos elsewhere. And I think that is, kind of important to note. And I can show you a Labour council or a Conservative council or a Lib Dem council in exactly the same situation. I mean, think of all those councils recently that basically had to declare bankruptcy because, they couldn't make ends meet. Well, but you would then point out to others to say they're different. So, you can't judge one council and go, that's the model. Look at the other ones. They're performing much better.
If it's not too much of an absurd segue from Kent to Washington, D.C.
The good people of Kent will not think it's an absurd segue. So let's take it with them on that.
I mean, you brought up Donald Trump, and one of the principles that you've really stood upon and that you named as one of your core values earlier was defending Ukraine against Putin. And I'm totally aligned with that, as is Andrew, and every right
thing on the front lines. I mean, Andrew knows, he's been there. Drones buzzing overhead, etc. Yeah,
indeed. And yet, what we've seen with Trump's supposed peace deal over the last few days, I think, can only really be described as depraved, and I think we'd all be on the same page with that. Now, Reform, of course, isn't pro-Putin in the slightest, but in all the British parties within the Overton window, it perhaps is the one that has the most example of problems, the biggest example of problems in that regard. Nathan Gill is the most vivid example recently, the deputy Welsh leader who was jailed for 10.5 years for taking Russian bribes. We saw before the last election in 2024, Nigel Farage, your new leader, telling Sky News that he thought Ukraine had provoked Putin, which then led the Led by Donkeys campaign group to unveil that Putin banner behind him during a speech. Now, Farage later described Putin as a very bad dude, and fine, I'm not saying he's pro-Putin, but it was notable that there was after the Trump plan was released, that there was a headline in the Telegraph, remarking or reporting on the fact that Farage had condemned it, as if that was an unusual occurrence or a surprising occurrence. So how do you feel with your staunchly pro-Ukraine credentials going into a party that isn't pro-Putin, but has some, problematic news reports in its back catalogue in that regard?
I think that's down to a total misunderstanding of what say Nigel Farage believes in this sort of context. Nigel Farage believes in putting British strategic interests first. Okay, that's his sort of positioning. And he knows, as you said, that Vladimir Putin is a bad man. He knows that. And, he has condemned things. He's also, recently spoken about if Russian, planes, enter NATO airspace, they should be shot down. I mean, this is not a pro-Russia party. And you don't appoint me, for God's sake, as, a party advisor, given that I fought Putin for 20 years. I've been sanctioned by Putin. Putin knows he ain't going to get no love from me in this sort of area, in this sort of setup. That's not what reform's about in this area. I think, the focus, of course, is everyone, and you mentioned Trump's plan is depraved. Look, the first thing to note, that everything Donald Trump does is not the final, the final settlement in that sort of way. My observation of Donald Trump is that what he's trying to do is, I think he is interested in, in the concept of peace, full stop. Okay, that's the idea. The way he gets there is very unusual, though. He's very different to most leaders. Most leaders, would come up with, say, a firm fixed plan that's been negotiated in advance, and you then put the plan on the table, rather like, my PhD background was in the Bosnian War. So rather like basically what happened at Dayton, you got the sides together, they, did some shuttle diplomacy, you banged the stick, you got them to sign basically on that basis.
But Trump
is in a very different way.
But Trump cooked up this plan with Putin behind closed doors, with Zelensky not involved. Shouldn't he surely have cooked it up with Zelensky, with Putin not involved, at the very least?
Well, hang on. Actually, if you think about how you get to peace, you've got to have them both involved. If you look at the mechanics,
but if you're going to go with one, if you're going to choose one or the other,
here's the thing I'm saying about Donald Trump. He doesn't do this in the Orthodox. This is no Camp David. You don't have Putin over there, Zelensky over there, and Trump is shuttling between the two places. That's not how this works. His version of peace negotiations is he puts an idea down, it could get shot down quite dramatically, and then he starts to change it. Initially, he'll say, "Oh, the deadline's on Thursday." Then he'll start saying, "Well, this isn't my final offer," etc. What he's trying to do is get people to think, I think, about how you get there. And I think it's interesting to look at, the modeling around, say the Middle East peace deal he did to get there. That required a lot of finessing, a lot of sort of shoving this way and that way.
I believe that the direct quote was that Trump said that if Zelensky didn't agree to this plan, he could then fight his little heart out.
Yes, but he's also last night said, that's not my final offer. So he's not, here's what I'm saying. You can't, when he puts something down, that's not the final suggestion. There's always room for maneuver within that. And what he's trying to do is make some progress. So, his form of doing that is, right, I'm going to put a plan down. It might not be perfect. Let's talk about it now and see where we get to and how we move it forward. That's my observation.
Well, you say might not be perfect, but it's essentially a recipe for total Russian victory and total Ukrainian defeat.
The Ukrainians can't sign that.
An almost Munich-like disaster for Ukraine. And yet this is Mr. Trump's first offer, is to give Vladimir Putin an overwhelming victory and to crush Ukraine. I mean, that is a very, very strange starting point for negotiations. If an equitable outcome is what you're really interested in.
But this isn't actually the starting point. I mean, there have been lots of, potential plans put down and lots of ideas put forward. This is perhaps, the most worked up one to date. But there have been other, at times he said this and that in this sort of way. Ukraine can't sign this current deal. That's obvious. Okay, this is not a deal that if you're Ukraine, you can sign. And I think, that's been the understanding over the last 2-3 years. We've got this, there are talks happening right now with Marco Rubio and, a Ukrainian, high-level delegation to look at, well, which parts of this can you sign? Let's, as with every negotiation, what are the bits that you think are viable because you want to end the war as much as we do, and what bits will you not sign? And I'm sure you're going to start seeing some movement on that basis. Would it have been the plan I would have put down as, on first, securing? No, it wouldn't. That's not the plan I would have put down. But it is a plan that, has some merit within it. Ukraine can't sign it as it currently is. Can it be improved? 100%. Will it be improved? I think it will be.
Did the Nathan Gill case worry you before joining Reform? Did it give you pause?
No, not at all, because I tell you this, there are traitors, frankly, and these are treacherous people who are taking money from foreign states to undermine their own country. that occurs everywhere. That's not. I don't think that's a reform.
Really? It goes everywhere. I can't think of any other example in recent memory of that happening in British politics.
We've just had a very interesting failed spy case for the Chinese.
But that's not that. Yeah, fine. But they were two advisors. They were not, political figures like Nathan Gill was, the deputy leader of Reform in Wales. I mean, that's an entirely different case, isn't it? I mean, I can't think of any example of a politician being found to have taken a bribe
Probably not
from a
since
hostile
John
foreign power.
Stonehouse, perhaps in that sort of sense. But I think it doesn't bother me that from a reform perspective he's done that. He's a bad apple. He's a traitor to his country. I don't think it's because he was in reform that he was a bad apple. I think he was a bad apple. Full stop. End of story.
Oh, look, we've spoken about the core beliefs that got you into politics, and your belief in a small state, low tax. How do you square that with the reports of some of the policies that the Reform's thinking of implementing, like nationalising the steel industry and potentially 50% of utilities? The 90 billion tax cuts were downgraded by Richard Tice from a promise to an intention. And we're looking at a huge amount of money that is going to need to be spent. And we've seen what's happened with Liz Truss, what happens when you have uncosted tax cuts or uncosted huge amounts of spending increases. How does that square with the Alan Mendoza manifesto?
The Mendoza Festo.
Yeah.
I don't recommend that, by the way, as a but look, from that perspective, I think Reform's economic policies are very much a work in progress. A lot of people have gone, oh, well, what you said in 2024 has to be what you believe now. I don't think that's true at all. I think the economic situation is dramatically worsened. I think you saw, as you quite rightly said, there's already been a change in terms of the sense of rather than having a massive tax cut giveaway, which the economy can't sustain, there's now a sense of actually, we've looked at this properly now and we're starting to develop a set of policies that are going to reflect what we're going to go into the next general election with. Quite clearly, the idea that you can do unfunded tax cuts of any kind is for the birds. That's not going to happen. The British economy is in a parlous condition. There's no doubt about that. It's got to stabilise. Now, my preferred solution for that would be, of course, to cut spending where we can cut it, and then look at the tax burden afterwards. But the key to it, I think the key to everything is growth. This is the magical component that seems to have been forgotten by everyone, certainly by the current government. You can stabilise the situation if you want on a high tax economy, and a high spending economy. You can do that, but that is not going to lead to growth. And if you do that, you're ultimately going to immiserate the nation. What we desperately need are policies that are going to encourage growth, that encourage business to expand, that are going to sort of, drive sort of the improvements in GDP that are going to cascade down to people in this way. That, I think, is where Reform are going to be making their mark in the coming weeks. Watch that space, because that growth area is where we can end up with, a decent level of spending, decent level of taxation, but also a rising tide that is going to lift the country to different places as well.
I mean, that's uncontestable, the fact that we need growth to get out of this mess. I mean, even Keir Starmer before the last election was saying, I've said his name now, just don't want to say it 3 times or he might appear.
We got you there, yes.
He might appear and
taken about half an hour, but we've got you there to the point, yes.
I mean, even he said before the last election that he was planning to stimulate growth to get us out of this hole, which obviously his policies have led us in the opposite direction. But in order to get growth, you need to basically cut spending and cut tax. Let's look at it in that basic way. But Reform, in its manifesto in the last election, I know you've said that it was the last election, but nonetheless, it budgeted for 141 billion of spending increases over 5 years, including an extra 17 billion for the NHS. As Andrew said, Richard Tice has wobbled on commitment to lower taxes, saying that it's just an intention, not a firm commitment. Is that a recipe for growth? I mean, is Reform, if you take away woke issues, if you take away borders and take away climate, is Reform a right-wing party of growth or a left-wing party of big statism?
I don't think Reform necessarily is a right wing or a left wing party. Looking at it from a
really?
No, I think there's an interesting coalition within Reform of different interest groups and different sort of setups. What I think it is, though, is a party that's going to put the British interest first, as it were, in the sense of looking at what it is for this country to restore itself economically, socially, demographically, beyond in that. Let me just come back then I'll come back to the point.
Yeah.
Watch this week the response to the budget. Watch the response to the budget. Like I said, reforms, economic policies are very much still a work in progress. And I know people want to look at the last manifesto. Well, reform was, a glimmer, that was it at the time. That manifesto did not, although reform got MPs elected and got a significant number of votes, that manifesto was ultimately not endorsed by the British people. Let's just remember that. So, now the challenge is to create a manifesto, an economic policy that will be endorsed by the British people. So, there's a lot of thinking going on in there. And I think, again, if you look at the backgrounds of Richard Tyson, Zia Yusuf, look at their professional backgrounds and where they sit in the growth question and where they might be going from the perspective of, well, are we going to be, high tax and high spend or low tax and low spend? Just look at the people in charge of the policy. Think about that as a starting point. That should give you a clue as to where this will head.
I'm just quite amazed to hear you say that, someone like you, a Tory for so many years, with a very clear set of values, as you laid out right in the beginning, which are conservative values, that you've now joined a party that you're not sure whether it's left or right wing.
No, I'm certain that the values that I have, sort of pushed forward in politics for 30 years are reflected in reform.
But they're right wing values.
I want to. Yeah, I would say some of the right-wing values. I say some just common sense values. I think, if you want to...
It's the same thing if you ask me.
Thank you. If you want to boil it down, I think Reform is a common sense party. And I think common sense, you might say left-wing, right-wing. Actually, it's really more about the ideas and the labels on that basis. And I think we make a big mistake in British politics to say that, X is a left or right-wing thing. Let me give you one great example. Okay, in my professional career, people say that fighting for freedom is a right-wing thing. It isn't. Freedom is a basis for all of us.
No, sure, but high tax and high spend is not right wing or common sense, and or pro growth.
It is not pro growth. I would agree with that basis. Absolutely, absolutely. In my view, you stimulate growth by enabling, to quote the Gladstonian phrase, money to fructify in the pockets of the people. This is the line that drives things. It is ultimately people who drive growth, not the state. That is the core challenge. And I think if you look at where Richard Tyson and Zia Yusuf are and their careers, they understand that.
How do you feel about their treatment of Rupert Lowe? It seems there was a significantly dirty tricks campaign against him with false allegations, leaked to the press. A variety of really nasty political tricks seem to have been deployed. What does that say to you about the leadership of Reform?
So what it says to me is that I have no idea what went on there. I'm serious. I don't know what Rupert Lowe did behind the scenes to provoke a response and how that all, played out. So I can't, without any context, it is very difficult to work it out. Do I think that there should be, room for divergent views? Absolutely. But if, and again, I don't know if it's true, if Rupert Lowe had been doing something behind the scenes to destabilize the party, well, then you can't have someone in your ranks who's trying actively to overthrow the sort of, the model or whatever it is. So I just don't know enough about the situation to judge it. I can see that something pretty bad happened, though, for that to have been a rupture of that nature to have occurred.
On the surface, from what we know in the public domain, Zia Yusuf comes out of it fairly poorly. Did you not think that was a degree of due diligence you needed to do before you jumped over to Reform?
I've spoken to the leadership of Reform for some time, and I see no problems in anything I've seen there from that perspective. I really don't. So again, I've got no idea what went on there behind the scenes. I don't think it matters ultimately for the future of the country. I think, Reform as a unit is going to develop, is going to change, and it's going to change for the better.
Well, let's pivot to talking about some positive aspects of Reform, because we've been giving it a bit of a hammering over the past few minutes. I think the one thing, we had Nick Timothy on this podcast a few days ago, talking about the creeping Islamist attempt at dominance of the UK, his attempts to fight and stand against it. Very courageous, really good interview, brilliant man. The policy that really stands out to me with my particular interest in this area of reform is to ban the Muslim Brotherhood, which Nigel Farage declared at the last conference, which I, by the way, advocated in my book, which Farage endorsed. So I'm not sure I can take credit, but okay, I'll take the...
No, Jake, take it. You are the originator of the policy. Just go with it.
Okay, I will steal the credit. I will pick Nigel's pockets for the credit. But either way, it's an amazing, amazingly bold move to commit to that. What's your sense about reforms? We've talked about how reform is untested in government and all the rest of it. What's your measure of reform's commitment and ability to actually tackle the creep of Islamism in Britain and resolve that real threat to our way of life?
Oh, I think the resolve is absolute. I think this is a party that understands the threat. It understands the threat from a values basis. It understands the threat from a political basis and a societal, but it gets it totally. It understands that anything that speaks of separation rather than cohesion, that suggests the creation of a sectarian identity that is antithetical to the values of this country is a massive, massive problem, particularly as it has visibly grown over the last 20 years. It's very interesting. As you know, Douglas Murray used to work at the Henry Jackson Society. He was very fond of saying, he often meets people who say, well, I wasn't worried about Islamism 10 years ago, but I'm terribly worried about it now. But you never meet anyone who goes the other way and goes, I was worried about it 10 years ago, but not now. Yeah. There's a reality. I think, Reform as a political party are the people who were worried about it 10 years ago already and are even more worried about it now. And were they to be in power, we would absolutely act strongly against this and try and push back the tide. And I say try because, I listened to your chat with Nick. It is a difficult task. This has now become entrenched as an idea. And we've seen it flex its political muscles. We've seen it, flex its societal muscles. There's going to have to be a whole of society approach, a joined up approach to pushing it back. But you need to start, don't you, with a party that is absolutely determined to kill it dead, and to say not that we're going to tolerate it in some shape or form, but to say we're going to, either push it right to the sidelines completely or try and expel it full stop. And that's a big societal battle, but it needs to be fought. It needs to be won.
So this isn't a gotcha question. It's more a think piece of a question. But my concern is, particularly for reform, is when you have an agenda against immigration where people are kind of alienated from your policies because they feel victimized because they're immigrants and they're going to be either asked to return from whence they came or lose benefits or whatever the policy might be. How do you, when you're fighting something like Islamist extremism, make sure that you carry with you those moderate Muslims who are so essential and who are the absolute most at risk from Islamic extremism? How do you take them with you when you are portrayed publicly as being on a crackdown against anyone who's come here from abroad? How does reform square that circle?
Let's just start by saying that seems to be the general view today of all political parties. If you listened to the Home Secretary recently, Andrew, I think who obviously comes from a Muslim background, I think you'll find that this is now the consensus in British society. But I may say it's a consensus that was driven by Nigel Farage. He is a person who has shifted that, in my view, pretty single-handedly to a place where the Labour Party is now, auditioning to be reform when it comes to migration. That, by the way, won't work because there's going to be a whole legal set of battles that they will not be able to resolve. And, they're going to founder on that. But rhetorically, at least, everyone is where reform is. So I don't think it's a question of that. I think also you have to go into migrant communities and understand that those people who've been here 2-3 generations are upset about what's happened since. A lot of people who came in the 1970s or 80s worked their way up, had to take the school of hard knocks, did not get free money from the government and, hotel accommodation, all the rest of it, or, social housing for life on arrival, but had to make their way, sometimes in a fairly difficult climate, where they were facing a lot of prejudice. And those people, I was always struck knocking on doors and meeting people who came in that era who said, you've got to do something about immigrants. And I'm like, but your family were immigrants. And they were like, yeah, absolutely. But we came here, did the school of hard knocks, fought our way through, and these people are cheating the system. I think it's a sense of cheating the system that is more important here than actually looking at people, from the perspective where they came from. People have arrived and have settled and have made their home here, understand the rules. Not everyone, because we had the problem with the Islamists, but a lot of people understand the rules and they want to be part of the sign, and they hate seeing it undermined going forward. To fast forward it into where you were saying about the need to get moderate Muslims on side, absolutely. But that's why you don't make statements like Islam is evil, because Islam isn't evil. Islam is a religion that has multiple interpretations. Oh, there are certainly some evil interpretations within Islam, absolutely. But there are also some peaceful, benign, lovely interpretations in terms of how you can look at. So I think we have to start developing a sense of nuance about Islam and saying this isn't about Islam per se. This is about interpretations of Islam that are separatist, that are sectarian, that are backwards thinking, and which are, as you say, the first victims are going to be those Muslims who are more liberal-minded, because they're the ones who are first going to be tapped on the shoulder to say, well, brother, you're a terrible Muslim, and we're going to make sure that you're going to be a better Muslim. I think the fear is, among those people, that they're going to get caught up in the Islamist, sort of surge, and will be forced into it. And I think we have to remember, one other thing to remember about this is as follows. If you are a reform-minded Muslim, and I mean that not in the political sense, but in the sort of I want to look at a British Islam that reflects the modernity as opposed to the 7th century in Arabia, you need to be empowered to fight the radicals, because it's very easy if you are an assimilationist to go, this is not my battle. I don't want to fight some bearded guy, who's going to come after me and threaten me and do that. I'm just going to assimilate into society. I'm going to be part of my neighborhood and do that and not do the fight. Problem with that is that you lose that sort of campaigning zeal from the other end of people who go, not in my name, thank you very much. That is not my religion. And so we've got to do more to empower those, the liberal-minded Muslims in this country who, want to be the same as their neighbors, to say, you don't represent me, Mr. Islamist. And I'm going to fight you because I don't want my religion to be seen as your religion.
And I mean, in fact, the elephant in the room in this conversation, of course, is anti-Semitism, which is the first expression of the hatred that these Islamists have towards the West as a whole. You're from deep within the Jewish community in a good way. You're from the heartlands of Britain's proud Jewish community. What's your feeling about Reform's relationship and policies towards Israel? And perhaps as an appendage to that, can you just engage with that Guardian story that accused Nigel Farage, age 14, of having made anti-Semitic remarks and tried to whip people up in that regard?
Well, I think you've given the hint on that. Nigel Farage, age 14, 50 years ago. That's what they're coming up with? Seriously? This is a paper who very recently was supporting Jeremy Corbyn to become Prime Minister of this country, given his views on Jews. Okay, so this is ridiculous nonsense of the first order. I've spent lots of time in Nigel Farage. I have never seen a whiff of that. Not even a whiff. Had I done, I would never have gone over to Reform. I'm convinced that he is strongly supportive of the Jewish community, as are the other senior figures within Reform. They see British Jews, being an essential part of the tapestry of the nation, as they have been for hundreds of years in this country. And, he's going to do his best to make sure. I think what actually offends him deeply is that there are British Jews who think they have to leave the country because the country no longer is a safe place for them. He says that is not a British way of doing things. And that is, it actually, I've seen him get visibly angry at the idea that Jews should have to leave the country because of the anti-Semitism they're facing. So that tells me that he's got no truck with that. So, and if we look at the Israel question, he's been strongly supportive. Richard Tice has been strongly supportive. There's a Reform Friends of Israel in the offing. There's a Reform Jewish Alliance in the offing. But here's a party that is very friendly to British Jews and to Israel, and will continue to be friendly, in the future as well, because it understands that British Jews are a very successful community in the sense of they have assimilated fully into British life, played their part, fought in wars, driven, sort of the economy, contributed to culture, been prominent in the charitable field. This is Britain. They are a microcosm of Britain, and he wants to be supportive of them. And Israel, equally on the front lines, is a democratic ally who, needs stronger support because its enemies are our enemies too.
Do you get the feeling that Reform's attitude towards Israel's support for Israel is a deep and meaningful one, rather than, as some people say, simply because the other side support the Palestinians and a sort of culture wars thing in Britain? Do you feel it has that substance behind it?
No, I think it's philosophical.
Thank you for joining us for this conversation on The Brink. If you want to hear the rest of it, head over to our Substack page, where it will be present and correct for you to enjoy.
And if you enjoyed our conversation, please do like, subscribe, follow and comment. We always love to hear from you.
Until next time, see you again on The Brink.